Could I ask Shawqi Issa to come up, please? And could I remind you, you have 10 minutes, please.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I'll try. And anyway, not much left for me to say after all the speakers. And unfortunately, we don't have presentation for Israeli government here. I am very curious to hear what they could say after all what we heard yesterday and today. They might say what you expect them to do. They have a project and they couldn't massacre all of us. So they might violate some human rights norms here and there, commit some crimes here and there, but otherwise they have to give up their project, which is racist by itself. I think the idea or the goal of Zionism could be implemented easily if they did what the Americans did with the natives in the United States. But they came 200-300 years late to do the same. And it's also not like South Africa, where it's one country and everybody is a citizen. So they ended up with a very complicated system. Some Palestinians are citizens of Israel, others are citizens of occupied, controlled land, and the third are refugees all over the world. So it's very, very difficult for them to cover the racism in their system. Many people talked about the military laws, the civil laws in Israel, which clearly shows apartheid system, and it's easy to prove that. If you talk about the soul of the legislations, it's more difficult if you go to the technicalities of the laws. But there are many hidden actions not written anywhere, which also shows the apartheid system inside Israel and in the occupied territories. And comparing with South Africa, you might see identical examples and many similarities, although comparison is usually crippled, as Goethe said, but the similarity is always there. And one example is District 6, what we heard yesterday and before yesterday. And if you go to see what happened in Israel with the village Ekroth and Boram, it's the same basically. The people of these two villages are Israeli citizens, Palestinians, were moved out from the villages. Although the Supreme Court in Israel decided they can go back, but the government already 20 years since that decision and don't allow them to do so. So it's similar to what happened in District 6. So I want to talk more about West Bank and Gaza after 67 and the regulations which you might not find written anywhere, some of them, which shows the racism in the Israeli policy. Shortly after they occupied us in 67, they understood that they can't continue implementing Fourth Geneva Convention. So they stopped after a few months because that convention will prevent them from implementing their project, which is take the land and force the people out. So they had to stop it and replace it with thousands of military regulations. First, two of them were to control all the water resources in the occupied territories. And then freeze all the land registrations. Jeff mentioned in his speech, Jordan started, and they immediately after the occupation freeze these registrations because they knew they are going to confiscate the land and demolish the homes. Then they started a whole system how to force Palestinians to leave the country and immigrate abroad. Like, for example, no Palestinian could obtain a driver license without a permission from Shabak, the secret service in Israel. So this is not written anywhere, but when you go to do it, you are faced with the regulation. Nobody could install a telephone line at home or in the office without approval. Of course, I'm talking about Palestinians, not settlers or Jewish. Nobody could leave the country. Even they made the regulation very complicated that if any Palestinian wanted to leave the country, must obtain the permission from Shabak, and it gives you a right to go abroad for 3 years. They know it's mostly students who leave, and they need 4 years at the university. So they made the permission 3 years, and if you don't go back, you lose your right to go back. And this is how we had many thousands who lost their residency rights in West Bank and ended up outside because they wanted to finish their university study. And at the same time, if you get this permission and leave, you are not allowed to come back before 9 months. So these are some examples of regulations people don't know about. It's not written. Although if you want to move from one village to another and change your address, again, you need the approval. So the strategy is the same. They want to force us out, take the land. Everything they did fits in this. Even opening the labor market inside Israel was meant to pull the farmers from farming their land in order to confiscate it. So they opened the market for farmers in the villages to go work inside Israel with high salaries and leave the land, and then they come and confiscate the land. And they use the old laws that if you don't continuously use the land, then they can confiscate it. And although even if you use it for seasonal products, then they will say this is not continuous and take it. And even if you pay taxes to Israel, it doesn't mean in their courts that it's an ownership. Another laws, I will stick to what's written here you wanted us to talk about the last legislation about BDS, about boycott inside Israel. They are smart enough to force every citizen of Israel to participate in the crime, because settlements is a crime. So every citizen in Israel is forbidden by this new legislation to boycott the settlement products. So they're basically forcing them to participate in the crime. The other one about marriage. Any citizen of Israel wants to marry a Palestinian from occupied territories are forbidden to live together inside Israel. I think it's so easy to see the apartheid system inside Israel itself and in the occupied territories. And I think the international community is participating and giving the Israelis the opportunity to do so and continue. And Israel was smart enough to convert its occupation to be funded by Europe and the United States and even the United Nations. Since the Oslo Agreement was signed, the occupation continued, but Israel is not spending any money anymore. All the world is spending the money for them to occupy us. I believe that Israel as such is a very unique example in history. I see it rather, it's not a country, rather a club or a farm, and every Jew on the planet is a member of, and has a full right to come and participate and control the natives there. So I don't think we need to do a lot of work to prove the racism and discrimination and apartheid. It's there, and many speakers could prove it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for keeping to the time. Does any member of the panel want to ask a question? Ronnie?
Thanks very much. for that tremendous insight. And you use the analogy of Israel as a club. I think it's actually very pertinent. But in your view, what lies behind the motive of the Western powers, United States and European Union, of ignoring the reality of what you describe in terms of the way the Palestinian people are treated, ignoring that and deciding that they must support Israel at all costs? You know, people have debated this. Is it the power of the Zionist lobby in America and Europe? Is it the strategic interest of the Western countries? In your view, what lies behind this particular problem?
Well, I think I need a lot of time to speak about that, but I don't believe it's the power of the Zionist lobby in the United States, no. It might play a role in some things, but not the whole strategy itself. I believe in politics, there are no place for principles or morals. So the United States is a country who controls the Middle East and uses Israel as a tool for that control. It's true that sometimes you see contradiction between the American interests and the blind support of Israel, but it's always under control, and the Americans use the fact that the dictators of the Arab countries are easy to control and they don't have much demand except to secure their positions. So the United States continue supporting Israel to use it to control the Middle East, and because there is no pressure from the other side to minimize this support. Also Europe, not only the United States, and I believe the silence of Europe is giving the Israelis the opportunity, or actually they encourage the Israelis to commit more crimes by not doing anything against them. And some of these crimes they don't even need to do to continue their control, but because of this encouragement from all over the world, mainly Europe and the United States, they do these crimes. And we, as Palestinians, we believe they are responsible as participants in these crimes. And the Israelis, it's easy for them to cover their crimes in front of the, if I can say, naive American public, because they don't know much and they ignore, they don't care about what's happening. And they also can market the Holocaust use and the anti-Semitism and all this in Europe to go ahead with their crimes. Yeah.
One final question, so very briefly, Stephen.
This last question, I think, is important. The world is changing. There are now large countries which have more influence in the world. It has been seen when Palestine obtained membership of UNESCO. There are hundreds of countries now who seem to take the case of Palestine more seriously. And the United States and our unfortunate Europe are being less exclusively responsible for the way world society is moving. Do you find that in the relations between Palestine and other countries there is some hope of a more solid support for Palestinian independence and a less shy way of looking at relations with Israel?
Well, hope and optimism is always there. Otherwise, we'll commit suicide. especially Palestinians in the occupied territories, either commit suicide or immigrate outside of the country, or be optimistic and have hope. And actually meeting a person like you give us a lot of hope that sooner or later we'll win, and you've been fighting for your beliefs for decades. And if something was approved in the last 63 years, it's true that we couldn't win our fight, but more important, it was proved that we were not defeated. We're still there, and we continue our fight. The confusing thing here is that it's true the world is changing, and we get support from more communities and more groups, but in the same time, the situation on the ground inside the occupied territories is much worse in every aspect. Like I believe nowadays in the military courts, when they try 10 years old kids, and the punishment is deportation from the house. It's unbelievable how such things could happen. It wasn't like that, for example, in the mid-70s when I was a child in jail. It was better than 2011. So this is a confusing a little bit, that the mechanisms to prevent the crimes and to use the changes and the support, I don't think it's quite there yet. But we have hope still.
Thank you. You may step down.